Hello again, I'm Mr. eTutor, your Mr. eTutor here at MrEtutor.com, and welcome to video module 11-2. In this module, we'll be talking about how you select the individual subject tests that you're going to take. We need to start out by figuring out which subject tests are the best for you to take. This is a part of the process that a lot of students overlook, actually. They sort of just decide they're going to pick 3 things that they have in their classes, and then they go get ready for those tests, spend a whole lot of time and energy doing something that they don't actually care about and are not perhaps particularly well suited for. And then they get lower scores than they wanted. They end up frustrated and miserable and sad, and so I'd like to try to help you avoid that, of course. So before we even get into how you take the tests, we need to talk about which tests you're going to be taking. This discussion kind of assumes that you've already done some initial college research, and that in your research you have decided which colleges you're most interested in applying to, and you know what their policies are. Some colleges don't require any subject tests, some require 2 subject tests, and some require 3. Now, some will happily accept your scores, but don't actually require them. So you're going to want to know where you stand with all of your different colleges and what their policies are, what works best with their admissions process. And these are the sorts of things, of course, that you want to be working out when you do your initial rounds of college intelligence gathering. So let's assume that you've done that stuff and you know which colleges you want to apply to, you know roughly what those colleges' policies are towards the subject tests, and you are ready to get going and ready to start by picking the tests that will best represent you and best play to your strengths. Most college counselors and tutors will tell you that you should go ahead and take tests that you have classes for. So for instance, if you're in, freshman biology or something, they'll tell you, go ahead and take the biology subject test. Now, in my opinion, that's a terrible piece of advice, which actually makes it pretty similar to most of the other advice that you'll get from most tutors and college admissions counselors and so on. You don't want to feel like you need to take a particular subject test just because you took that subject in school. It's a bad idea for 2 reasons, actually. The first reason is if you don't have a particular affinity for a subject, you're probably not going to like it very much, and that's only going to make getting ready for the test that much more excruciating. The second reason, and it might actually even be more important, is the fact that the subject tests that you select and the scores that you submit will communicate something to the admissions people at the colleges that you apply to. So if you're not particularly interested in biology and you submit a biology score and it's not an excellent biology score, what does that tell the person who's looking at your application? You know, it tells them that, first of all, you probably don't really have any serious ambitions or any subjects you like very much, or it tells them you're not very good at the subjects that you should be liking because those are the ones you send the test scores in. So we're going to want to make sure that you pick tests that reflect something about your academic interests and or that will offer you opportunities to score very highly and to impress the people at the colleges that you apply to. And, of course, since you are probably very, very busy with all of your extracurricular activities and things like that, we also want to make sure that we try to pick subject tests that will be easy for you to prepare for. We don't want to have to, for instance, pick German if you have never taken a German class and don't speak German, which might sound kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised the sorts of things that you run into. So make sure that the tests that you pick reflect something about what you're good at, what you could be good at very quickly, or what you're interested in. You know, somewhere in there you want to find the happy medium. Now, here are the 3 tests that I recommend most people consider taking. I recommend you consider the literature test, one of the math tests, and one of the history tests. And here's why. The literature test is basically the same as the critical reading test from the SAT-1. It has a few things that separate the 2, of course, but overall, the skills that you're going to need are pretty much the same. You need to be able to read carefully, and you need to be able to figure out which answer choice restates what you just read, just like on the critical reading for the SAT-1. So if you've had any success at all with critical reading on the SAT-1, the literature test is probably going to be pretty easy for you to pick up. I recommend one of the math subject tests for pretty much the same reason. The math subject tests are essentially the same as the SAT-1 math test, except that the math questions themselves can be a little bit more complex, they can be a little more complicated, they can involve ideas that would never be allowed to appear on the SAT-1. But the strategies we talked about for the SAT-1 as far as measuring diagrams when that's appropriate, considering where the answer choices came from, things like that, all of that stuff will still apply to the subject tests in math. So again, if you've had any success at all with SAT-1 math, the subject test math will probably come relatively easily to you. Now finally, for the history tests, even though there is nothing like the history tests on the SAT-1, the fundamental skill underlying both of the history tests is the ability to read something and kind of think about what must be true, given the few basic things that you do know. So for the history test, you don't actually need to learn every single fact about every single event that ever happened in either America or the world. All you actually need to do is sort of understand the broad strokes in each subject, and then read the questions very carefully and practice a little bit with some critical thinking skills that will help you figure out, again, which of the answer choices can be separated out as the correct one. Remember, that's very important for all of the tests. You don't actually want to know the answer to every question necessarily. You just need to be able to read the 5 answer choices and figure out which one of the 5 of them must be correct and which 4 must be wrong. And on the history test, that's probably the easiest to do out of all the remaining subject tests. This doesn't mean that I'm saying that you can't take a language or science or whatever else you might feel like. It's just that if you don't really have any particular leaning one way or another, I would strongly recommend you consider some combination of literature and math and history. If you are a native or near fluent speaker of a foreign language, of course, feel free to go ahead and take that, especially if that plays into your overall application strategy. And similarly, if you are really incredibly good at a particular science, say for instance, maybe you've gotten a really good grade on the AP in that science, or you've studied it for a long time, or studied on your own, or anything along those lines, then I would recommend perhaps considering that science exam as well. But please do us both a favor and don't try to take a language or a science if you don't care about that language or that science. It's going to make preparing for it much more challenging, it's going to make your scores harder to achieve, and it's probably going to send a message to the college admissions crew that you don't mean to send. So if you have the grades and the interest in those subjects to pull off the subject tests, go for it by all means. If you don't, the 3 tests that I listed are probably going to be the place you want to start. Now there's one other thing that you need to consider when you're trying to decide which test to take. The testing populations for the subject tests are not the same as the testing populations for the SAT-1. Everybody who's applying to college takes the SAT-1, but the only people who take the subject tests are people who are interested in those subjects. This means that the margin for error is different on different tests, and you want to consider that when you're deciding which test you should take. On the Practice Math 1 subject test that the College Board provides in the official subject test study guide, you can only miss 1 question and still end up with a score of 800, whereas for the French with listening test in the same book, you can miss up to 10 questions, or I should say you can skip up to 10 questions and still make an 800 on that particular test. So the test that you choose is going to have a significant influence on how many questions you can skip or miss and still end up with a very high score. Bear that in mind as well. So finally, to wrap this up, let me just reiterate, it's really, really, really important that you give some time and consideration when you choose which subject tests you're going to take. Don't just blindly, randomly decide to pick 3 that you don't actually care that much about. Think about the message you'll be sending, think about how that fits into your overall application strategy, and think about how easy or difficult it will be to get a good score on the test you're selecting. Remember that good strategy applies in everything, whether it's taking a standardized test, or applying to college, or trying to get your homework done as quickly and easily as possible, or whatever it is. So make good strategic decisions and consider beforehand which test is the right test for you. Thanks, and remember, if you pick the easy tests, it's easier than you think.